Good afternoon and good evening or good morning wherever you are in the world. Welcome to UK Fight Club's next webinar. Rex, can you move me on a slide, please?
Yeah, I can indeed. There you go.
Thanks very much. So the usual format applies. You are being recorded, everyone. Please remain on mute until the question and answer session. We're going to use the chat rather than Slido today for questions. So please do put your questions in there at any time, and we will answer them. One of the moderators, so myself or Andrew, will ask your question. You may be asked to unmute yourself and ask it in person. And at the end, we do have some notices, so please stay on to see what we have coming up. Next slide, please, Rex. Okay, so introducing Professor Rex Brynen. He is a professor of political science at McGill University and a senior editor of PackSims, which is a thoroughly good website for everything and anything to do with conflict simulation and wargaming. In addition to his academic research and teaching, he's worked as an intelligence analyst, a foreign policy analyst, and as a consultant on wargame design to the Canadian Department of National Defence, DSDL, NATO, and other agencies, NGOs, and international organisations. On a neat personal note, Rex and I playtested a counter-insurgency game in 2018. I was in Kabul and Rex was in Canada. So on to the title of the webinar. Major combat operations between conventional forces are often the context for many wargames. However, they make up comparatively little of history's repertoire of conflict. Even last month, only 3 countries in the world were actually engaged in a major war. That is to say, more than 10,000 deaths reported in the past calendar year. On a more personal note, the UK and its allies have been painfully bruised by 2 decades spent in the messy, interminable internal wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. Not only are these wars unpopular to fight, they are difficult to model for wargamers. Given that we are more likely to engage in these types of conflicts as the world becomes increasingly unstable and resource scarce, getting our wargames realistic is crucial to success in the future. Rex, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. As was said, I'll be talking about wargaming, peace stabilization, and counterinsurgency operations today. You've already heard a bit about me. I teach political science at McGill University. I work on a number of things, but obviously I also teach serious game design. I'm a consultant on game design to the Department of National Defence here in Canada and our foreign ministry as well. But others, in fact, the project I'm mainly working on right now is on epidemic preparedness and humanitarian response for Save the Children and Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And I've designed or co-designed some games, Aftershock, which is about humanitarian relief operations, the Matrix game construction kit, and eventually, inshallah, one day, that's publishing, we'll be bringing out either at the end of this year or early next year, We Are Coming Nineveh, which is a tactical operational level game of the liberation of Mosul from ISIS from Daesh in 2017. What I will be doing today is I'm going to be focusing on peace stabilization and counterinsurgency operations, wargaming them for professional purposes. Also for fun, obviously, but for professional development, in order to hone skills, or for analysis in order to better understand those kinds of conflicts. I'll talk, in doing that, I'll talk a bit about the challenges of designing and implementing games in those topics. I'll go through a few commercial games. It's not an exhaustive set. It's just a number of games that I want to make points deriving from, and then I'll offer some final thoughts. A lot of what we hopefully will get out of this session today is discussion rather than simply me talking at you. So that's the plan. And I want to start with the observation that, I mean, I'm a hobby wargamer. If you could, well, you can see a game behind me. It's not a very serious one because there's a giant lobster eating parts of Newfoundland there. It was a serious civil defense game. It's just the challenge wasn't very serious. I'm a hobby gamer. Hobby games are great. Hobby games can be used to sharpen our skills, but we have to, of course, recognize that commercial war games are designed to be enjoyable and to sell to people who generally want a competitive challenge and a degree of historical accuracy. They are not necessarily designed to fully explore complex conflict dynamics. They're not designed to teach lessons, although you can derive lessons from them. They're not designed to answer analytical questions, although in a few cases you can answer analytical questions with them. But they do contain insights, both the game is designed, but also often the game mechanisms that they may include may be quite useful if you ever do any game design of your own. Now, let me just talk about the terms I've been throwing about. Peacekeeping operations, generally UN or other multinational deployments in support of a peace process or an agreement or something like that. It's not an intervention to end a civil war. It's an intervention to facilitate an ending to a civil war that's in process or being agreed. Offensive missions, very rare. Even defensive missions, quite uncommon. The armed component is usually localized security, deterrence, presence, patrolling, and so forth. And they're usually part of a much larger and complex multinational mission with a political part and a diplomatic part and a development part, and humanitarian part, a rule of law part, and so forth. Stabilization operations, somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, train, equip, support, more kinetic operations, may or may not be part of larger and complex multinational missions. And some peacekeeping operations are also kind of stabilization operations. And counterinsurgency operations is fighting a war against an insurgency, either as the primary actor or in support of the primary actor. But of course, that kinetic war fighting is occurring in a highly political environment. Now, all war fighting occurs in a political environment. That's why Clausewitz told us that war is the continuation of policy by other means. But counterinsurgency or stabilization or peacekeeping occurs in an intensely political environment, where those political dynamics are ultimately absolutely core to the outcome. I'm going to spin some of my discussion. I'm going to plagiarize some of my discussion from a really good chapter by Volko Runke and Brynen in this book put out by MIT Press, Zones of Control. It's a big, fat, heavy book. You could kill someone with the hardcover edition. And they have a discussion in there talking about the really short chapter discussing the design of counterinsurgency games, which is important because Brynen and Volko are arguably the two of the world's leading, if not the leading designers of games around irregular warfare, insurgency, counterinsurgency, and so on and so forth. So I want to start with some points that they've made. They make the point that this is an uncomfortable topic for commercial games, and for a long period, there simply weren't many games that dealt with these topics. They talk too about the complexity of these kinds of operations, that they're multipolar, there's many relevant actors themselves are subdivided into factions, there's a lot of fog and friction, results are non-linear, the relationships between things are complex, it's difficult to model time and space, these insurgencies can go on for very long periods of time. I already mentioned fog of war, and of course it's asymmetric warfare, but not just asymmetric in terms of the means being utilized, but also asymmetric objectives. It's not a zero-sum game where your win is my loss. There's all kinds of competing and conflicting interests, which can make it a problematic space to design a game about. I'd also add that where we do have games on this, they're almost entirely at the counterinsurgency end of the spectrum, because not surprisingly, hobby wargamers want to fight a war. There are very few games on stabilization operations. There are almost no games on peacekeeping operations, because there's no market for people sitting down and playing a genuinely cooperative, incredibly frustrating game in which the outsiders don't have much leverage over what actually happens at the end. As someone who teaches peace operations, that's always been a bit problematic, because we just don't have the commercial games that easily translate into this space. And I want to make a point about peacekeeping and multinational stabilization operations, because to some extent, years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan have rather obscured what most of the pattern in the post-Cold War period has been, which is that Iraq and Afghanistan are the outliers, and what is much more common are routine UN or African Union peacekeeping missions. There's currently a dozen active around the world. The African Union also runs the really important mission in Somalia, or largely in Mogadishu and parts of the center and south of Somalia. Now, not all of those missions are hot missions in the slightest. Some of them have been around for decades and decades and decades, and they don't do very much. But some of them are hot and risky. I've circled the ones there that could see significant risk of armed action. During the current operations, those that are currently ongoing, have suffered about 1,400 casualties, and that excludes the African Union mission in Somalia, for which we don't have decent casualty numbers, but it's a good guess that around 1,500 African peacekeepers have died trying to keep the Somali government, or at least the government that controls Mogadishu, alive. So that's if you include the African Union mission, that's about 100,000 people currently deployed on peacekeeping missions around the world, for which we don't have games. So I'm not going to give you many examples of those because I don't have many examples to give you, but it's important not to forget them, because it may well be that for the next 25 years, this is the norm, as opposed to what we've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, to say a bit more about the complexity issue, to sort of add on to that warning that we heard from Brian Train and Volko Runke, on the right, you'll see a very famous PowerPoint from Afghanistan, which is often highlighted as an example, incorrectly highlighted as an example of a PowerPoint gone mad, of an insanely complicated PowerPoint. That's a little unfair, because the entire point of that PowerPoint was to make the point that operations in Afghanistan were insanely complex. I mean, if you look at that, you go, oh my God, I'm supposed to affect that in order to stabilize Afghanistan. That looks impossibly difficult. That was the point that the contractor was actually trying to make to senior leadership about the way Afghanistan works. Imagine trying to model that in a game. I mean, there's just a lot of moving parts. It's not as simple as having a stack of counters with combat ratings and movement allowances and some rules for odds ratios and a CRT and terrain effects. All of those things matter in terms of the political dynamics. We find in civil conflicts that there's also significant variation within and across populations. So the fact that one social group supports you doesn't mean that another social group supports you. Social networks can be extremely important. And the thing about these kinds of conflicts is they are both complex adaptive systems in which they're hard to change because they adjust to what you're doing, but they're also prone to informational cascades where you get runaway effects. And a good example of that were the Arab uprisings of 2011, where a single fruit seller with a protest in Tunisia sparked protests which grew and grew and grew, and saw regime change in Tunisia, in Egypt, civil war in Syria, civil war in Yemen, major protests in Bahrain, and a host of other countries. So that is hard to model too, that it's on the one hand complex adaptive, on the other hand it's prone to what we call informational cascades, where people rapidly change their behavior because they change their views, their perceptions of incentive structures. There's also so many actors involved in these kinds of operations that it's very hard to model the coordination challenges, the differences in goals and perspectives. And Western powers are often relatively marginal actors in the outcome. I think what we're seeing in Afghanistan, and let's be honest, we're essentially, the US now is the kind of final major actor, is pulling out of Afghanistan, having failed to create a self-sustaining Afghan government. That government will hang on for years, but clearly the Taliban is in the ascendancy. That just goes to show how weak the levers that outsiders actually have. What really determined what happened in Afghanistan were Afghan dynamics, which is not to say that American and British and Canadian and other NATO forces didn't have an impact. They clearly did. But the dynamics of Afghanistan are very powerful. I remember being at a NATO conference some years back on NATO's so-called comprehensive approach and the need for us to all work in harmony, which frankly, from the point of view of NATO, I think meant the NGOs and the UN following our lead, which is not anything that the NGOs or the UN was inclined to do. But towards the end of the meeting, one of the participants from Médecins Sans Frontières stood up and said, you know, the thing here is that NATO's not a terribly important actor. You know, you're just dilettantes You'll be in Afghanistan for a decade or so, or two, and then you'll go. And we were there more than a decade before you, and we will be there decades after you've left. So you're just like a rainstorm. You make a lot of noise, there's thunder and lightning, and you go again, but it's hard for us to consider you a major factor in the long-term trajectory in Afghanistan. And I think it was rather humbling for a lot of NATO generals, many of whom had served in Afghanistan, to be told by other people who work in Afghanistan that they really didn't consider them to be significant long-term variables in the outcome. Now, I want to highlight these issues of fog and friction and multipolarity and confusion by citing an absolutely terrific book by Mike Martin, which is An Intimate War, an Oral History of Helmand Conflict. Mike Martin has a PhD from KCL, but he also served as a British officer in Afghanistan, and he speaks Pashto. So he went back afterwards, part of his doctoral research, to do interviews and to try to understand, in particular, British counterinsurgency operations and Afghan dynamics in Helmand province. And there's a couple of interesting parts in a very interesting book. One, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone who's had much to do with Afghanistan, is he talks about the extent to which Afghan actors would try to label other Afghan actors as Taliban in an attempt to get NATO to come down on them. So this is, using NATO as their personal air force by spreading intelligence that a particular village was a hotbed of support for the Taliban, not because it necessarily was, but because they had some issue with that village or someone in the village. And that's something we see in other contexts too. My favorite part of the book is where he does interviews in Helmand province, and he discovers that the British, 2007, 2008 in particular, are engaging the wrong Afghans. They're coming down on people who aren't really Taliban supporters. They're working with people who actually are quite close to the Taliban. Their understanding of the dynamics of Afghan society is quite weak, to the point that many opinion leaders in the province were convinced that the British were secretly on the Taliban side. I kid you not. They felt that the Americans were working with the Afghan government. The British were still upset over the defeat of British forces in Afghanistan during the 19th century, and the British were secretly trying to undermine the Afghan government and US efforts to stabilize the country, because in their view, there was no other explanation for British actions other than they were secretly trying to get the civil war to become worse rather than better. These kind of conspiracy theories aren't unique to Afghanistan, but it highlights the discontinuities and the confusion in one actor not understanding what another actor is doing, the differences in perspective, that after years of British deployment in Helmand, members of the Afghan parliament, tribal leaders, NGO leaders were doubtful that the British were on the NATO side because they had a different explanation for what they saw as Britain's actions. So not to blame Britain. Similar things have been reported in other places, that conspiracy theories have arisen over NATO actions in Afghanistan because the locals don't understand them, and that's partly because the outsiders don't have a very clear sense of what is going on. The reason I bring this isn't a discussion about NATO actions in Afghanistan, is to highlight how the heck do you design it in a game? How do you design it in a game where it's not just a one-level game, but a 2, 3, 4, 5-level game in which the actors can fundamentally misperceive what game the other side is playing. Brian Train has this great guerrilla checkers, which is partly checkers and partly Go, and the two sides are playing different games. But really, in a case like Afghanistan, you have many different games with many different dynamics and many different levers and many different currencies of influence and many different objectives and so on and so forth. And that's hard to design in a game that you can play in 3 hours. Now, Phil Sabin, Professor Phil Sabin, and now retired from KCL War Studies, in his book, which hopefully most of you have read, on simulating war, talks about this balance between simplicity and accuracy, or as I prefer to think of it in terms of playability. You can make a game simpler with less complexity, makes it easier to play, makes it more accessible, but it risks teaching the wrong lessons because the game is more of an abstraction. And if the more that the game is an abstraction from reality, the more likely people will take the wrong lessons away from that game. The game of battleships is really easy to play, or Monopoly is really easy to play, but I wouldn't want anyone to understand modern naval combat or the real estate market from playing those games. Or you can go for the accuracy end, and you can try and build everything in. You can try and recreate that PowerPoint slide I showed you. One useful reason to do that is not only is the game more accurate, but it also highlights the complexity you have to deal with and how limited your instrumentalities are. It's what I call hubris management. It's always useful if a game teaches you that things are harder than you think they're going to be. But the more accurate the game is, the less playable it is. It becomes too complex to run. It becomes too complex to learn, because it's very hard to tell what cause and effect is if the game is too accurate. It can be difficult to run an analysis because there's too many variables, and if you've got too many variables, you can't actually draw any causal conclusions. So we've always got this trade-off between making the game playable and making the game accurate. I would add that where that balance should be fundamentally depends on what your objectives for playing the game are. Now, I say there, not how enjoyable the game is. If you're playing a game for fun, and everyone in Fight Club, or most people in Fight Club, like to wargame, that you don't want to play a game that's not enjoyable. So that is a consideration. Often when you want your audience to engage, particularly in a training or professional development setting, you want them to enjoy it because they'll engage more. But we shouldn't be choosing games solely or primarily on the basis of how fun they are, because they might be really fun, but a really terrible model of the thing that we're trying to look at. Command and Colors, Memoir 44, great games, really they're not terribly accurate models of what they're trying to represent. So you've got to think about your audience, your objective, what you're doing with the game, if you're going to use the game in a professional setting. And I'll come back to that later. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run through some games. Many of them you will know, some of them you don't, and I'm going to make points off of them, which really reflect the issues as I've just framed them. I don't know how many of you know UrbanSim. You should all know UrbanSim, but most of you don't know UrbanSim, which is in fact partly the lesson here. UrbanSim was developed by, I think, University of Southern California on a really large multi-million-dollar US Army contract to produce a training game for stabilization operations. Solo play. So you've got an automated insurgent, playable on a PC. It's tactical. You can see you're tasking companies down there in the bottom left, day by day. Complex political military model. I played it. It really is quite clever. It even does social networks, so that if you piss off the mayor, you suddenly find the police chief is much less cooperative because, in fact, they're related. It's quite easy to play in the sense that the interface works and so on and so forth. I think, and it's barely used. After all this development, lots of positive press coverage, huge launch. It's free if you're in the US military. Almost no one uses it as far as I can tell, partly because the US is moving on from this, but the main reason is I think it's so complicated, it's really hard to tell what you should be doing. So in other words, in making the game realistic, it makes it hard for a training audience or a PME audience to actually learn anything from it, because it's really unclear why everything's going to hell in a handbasket, because there are so many variables involved. As I said, I think it's a really interesting product, but it really didn't go anywhere because I think people had problems teaching with it. I'm going to go the other end. This is also a digital game. I'm sure none of you have seen it. In 90 Days. It's about humanitarian operations in a conflict setting. It's a mobile device game, so you can play it on your phone or your tablet, developed by Save the Children UK. And it is, I think, not very good. I'm slightly understating things here for the opposite reason. First of all, the narrative is badly designed, but it is so abstract. In this game, you essentially have faced with a series of challenges, and then you decide what's more important, time, quality, or cost, and you flick those icons at the problem, and then suddenly a solution emerges which you didn't know until after you'd made your choice, which is often really ridiculous. This has gone the other end, an attempt to make it highly accessible so that anyone can take their phone out, play it. This is supposed to be for training within NGOs. It's not an advocacy game to get people to give money to Save the Children. It's supposed to teach stuff. I think it's terrible, to the point that I wouldn't use it in a classroom because I think it teaches some of the wrong lessons. It's too prone to people mislearning from it because the choices are just way too abstract. There are other peace building or peacekeeping games or attempts at games that go in the other direction too. There was one that was developed with European Union funding in which you went around, again, as an NGO, trying to do a project in a conflict-affected country with an active civil war. Lots of detail, but essentially it was modeled on World of Warcraft, right? You actually maneuvered through the space. And so you spent far too much time walking around the city trying to find an office and working out who were the clickable people you could have a dialogue with, almost like having question marks or exclamation marks over their head in World of Warcraft. And that's not what you actually do in the field. In the field, most of your cognitive energy is not spent on route navigation in an urban environment because you just have a driver or a taxi driver. It's spent on the actual interaction with your partners. And so they went the wrong way. They were focusing on the wrong things in the game design. And so you spent far too much time doing skills which are not actually terribly relevant to what they wanted you to get out of the game. Now, those last three are all games designed for a serious purpose. Here we have one that's designed for the commercial war game market. I'm sure a lot of you know it. It's the GMT COIN series. Bottom left is a distant plane, the Afghan one, which is my favorite. The one on the right there is Fire in the Lake, which is the Vietnam War, and the top one is Andean Abyss, which is the first one in the series. Lots of these coming out, readily available, engaging gameplay, multipolar. Most of them are 4 players, apart from the Brynen Trains Algeria one, which is 2. It's our operational strategic level. Great at hubris management. You realize how hard it is to change things. Really complex adaptive system where if you start doing stuff, other actors find ways of countering it. It's what I call gamer level complexity, which means it does not work well with newbies. They get confused. And I think the card mechanism is actually really confusing for anyone who's coming at this from I want to learn about counterinsurgency and dynamics, because the cards are really central to gameplay. So from a game mechanic point of view, it's very clever, but I do not find it as a terribly cost-effective way of doing serious work on counterinsurgency. So by all means, play it. I like it, but I think it's a game that's best played with people who know gaming well. I'm not sure it's, given the amount of time it takes and so forth, that it's the best thing if you are trying to introduce counterinsurgency wargaming to newbie non-wargame players. I mean, I've used it in the classroom, but so it's not a critique of the game. The game's designed for commercial market, but if you're using it for serious purposes, I would have a few concerns. Here's one that most of you probably haven't played, unless you're as old as me. This is SPI's Freedom in the Galaxy. It's a Star Wars ripoff. It's ugly as hell. It does take a rather long time to play the campaign. Sort of strategic, operational, Paul Mill, counterinsurgency. Those are all star systems. Rebels go around trying to provoke rebellion, and the Empire goes around trying to crush it. The reason I flag this is it still has the best model of cascading political effects of any counterinsurgency game that's on the commercial market. In this game, when you successfully provoke a rebellion somewhere, it affects all the neighboring star systems, and it affects some star systems of the same race. And so you get this kind of Arab Spring type effect. Or it's a bit like pandemic, when the pandemic starts popping and you've got infection everywhere. Very similar kind of mechanic, and it works really, really well. Also, it's bureaucratic inertia, because until the rebellion reaches a certain stage, the Empire has to pre-plot all their movement. So they don't always have forces in the right places with the right kind of orders, and so on and so forth. Again, gamer mode, gamer level complexity. I wouldn't run this with a newbie audience, but if you're looking to steal a cascading effect, this is really clever. The other clever thing about this is it's a operational strategic game, but in the beginning you're actually playing at the cadre level. You have little cards who are the rip-offs of Star Wars characters, and they're the ones going around doing diplomatic missions and trying to provoke regions into rebellion and facing risk. And then that scales up. So it really does the kind of strategic corporal thing very well from the insurgent point of view, because those initial insurgent organizers, those key leaders, are actually really important in the first part of the game. In the latter part of the game, you get mass mobilization, you get combat units, you get space combat, and so forth. But it is ugly as hell. But I do think it still has the best cascading political effects model of any insurgency game on the hobby market. This is another one, Nicaragua in 1988, operational strategic game of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. So insurgency, counterinsurgency. I don't think that the combat model and the actual kinetic part of the Civil War is particularly exciting in this. What is really clever is the way that they've dealt with social groups and the interaction of class and ideology and political mobilization. On that, you'll see that each of the provinces has got little like infographics, little icons, and that signifies which social groups are particularly influential in that area. So on the East Coast, there are indigenous groups. In the cities, there are wealthy people. In the rural provinces, there are campesinos, there are peasantry. And it's not a game in which you simply have a single marker showing your popularity or your level of support amongst the population. You have a population support marker for each of these social subgroups, and how easily you can sway them depends on your political ideology. If you go hard to the left, it's easier to get the workers and peasants behind you, but you tend to alienate other social groups. If you start tacking towards the center, maybe you'll pick up some of the middle class, but it'll make it harder to mobilize urban workers or the peasantry. And that is one of the few games that really breaks down populations into complex mixtures and accurately, I think, models the fact that population support isn't a single variable, it's a quite complicated variable. I don't think it's a particularly amazing game to play, but I'm flagging what I think is a really interesting commercial mechanism. I design a lot of games, so I'm always looking for things to borrow. We are coming Nineveh. I'm gonna boost a game which I'm a co-designer on, although it was a couple of my students who did the main design work on it. Operational Tactical Liberation of West Mosul 2017. Low complexity, really easy to play. You actually have to do some mission planning before you do the execution. And it's intended to highlight the central role that the Iraqi security forces played. 99.7% of all the casualties fighting ISIS were Syrian and Iraqi, and the political challenges of urban operations. It has very ambiguous win conditions in the game. In fact, it even has a rule that under certain conditions, you can argue about who actually won, because the Iraqis have to be very worried about how badly they damage the city as they're trying to liberate it, yet at the same time, they don't want ISIS to hang around for a long period of time and be able to claim a political victory that way. So hopefully that will be on the market by the end of the year. Matrix games, well, I see Tom Mowat is in the audience, or he was. I can't look through the list right now. Matrix games lend themselves well to complex multi-sided conflicts. You see ISIS Crisis, which is sort of counter ISIS operations. The bottom right is, these are two versions on Google Slides, by the way. Bottom right is one that I used in one of my poli-sci classes this last year, the Syrian Civil War. The one on the bottom right probably took 90 minutes to design. That's a great thing about Matrix games. From scratch, from absolute scratch, probably took me 90 minutes to put a Syria Matrix game together, and then to execute it, distributed gaming via Google Slides. Really easy to design, really easy to run, or I think they're easy to run. A lot of subtlety and complexity because players can do essentially anything. In a Matrix game, you simply say what you're doing, and then the players debate how likely it is to work, and then you determine an outcome based on that via various adjudication techniques. Doesn't really use a lot of pre-written rules. And they're really good, therefore, for these kind of complex, multi-sided conflicts with different objectives and asymmetries of means as well. A downside of a Matrix game is the kind of one action per turn thing, which can be problematic, and the fact that you can't have high levels of granularity in them. I mean, they're a bit loosey-goosey, which is both a strength because it allows all kinds of innovative behavior, but also isn't providing you with detailed combat modeling results and outputs and so forth. Easily played, in person, you can easily run a game in 3 hours. It does take a bit longer online. I tend to find it. RCAT. So if you were in the British military and you wanted to run a stabilization game in your unit, one of the places you might go to is the Rapid Campaign Analysis Toolset, which was developed by Cranfield University and folks working with them for DSTL, which is essentially a wargame design toolkit in which you take a situation and then you can fairly rapidly design a wargame around it and then play it. Here you see one being play tested for operations in Liberia, but it's being used for all kinds of other things, the Falklands, other situations. We ran a game in Canada using our cat on one of our defense planning scenarios. I think it's quite clever because it's a basic, relatively low complexity war game. But at the same time, it allows for emergent gameplay because you can challenge the rules by a kind of matrix game type mechanism if you want to do something for which there isn't an existing rule, which, as playing the Red Insurgent in a game, I did a great deal of. I've seen very little about RCAT recently, so I don't know if this is a case of DSTL contracting for and getting a really excellent game designed, and then it kind of drops off because people aren't using it. There might be people in the call who know more, but I've seen it demoed a couple of times and I've played it once and I was impressed. It does require that someone know how to turn something into an RCAT war game and then run that game. And the games I've run were run with the designers, so there might be an issue with people who aren't the designers running the game. Brynen, this is how I teach peace operations and stabilization operations at McGill. And we have 100+ players playing 12 hours a day for a week whilst they're also in classes. So this is pretty intense. It runs like a large chaotic role-playing game. Very similar mix for the D&D players out there of having rigid rules, having written rules for certain things, and other things being up to umpire adjudication. Generally operational strategic, but with some tactical vignettes. I'll talk about that in a minute. And we've got a bit of everything in here. So I have a version of that map that shows all the military deployments of the various sides, the government irregulars, the various insurgent groups. But we've also got humanitarian development operations. We've got media operations. We've got civil society doing stuff. We've got neighboring countries. We've got diplomatic negotiations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The players don't really have to know the rules too much. They just have to say what they're doing. And then it's a bit like D&D. D&D players don't necessarily have to know all the D&D rules. They just have to operate within a framework. So it's very easy for people to learn to play. I don't actually tell anyone the rules beforehand for the most part. It's a 1-hour lecture and that's it. I use tactical zooms occasionally. So the level of analysis is usually your force commander, you're a political party head and what have you, but occasionally we'll zoom down to a confrontation at a checkpoint where you have that kind of strategic corporal situation where a small decision might have much larger political or military consequences. Tons of fog and friction. And in fact, we have to do multiple days of debrief because usually players realize they didn't really fully understand what was going on outside their area of responsibility. So if you're dealing with refugees, you knew the refugee stuff well, but other stuff you didn't know so well. If you were dealing with combat operations, you understood that, but you didn't understand the humanitarian implications of your combat operations, and so on and so forth. And that fog and friction is why I run this game. I want it to feel like a big chaotic game with lots of fog and friction, because I'm teaching a class in which there are tons of lecture notes and bulleted lists and best practices guidelines from the UN. And in the field, it's way more complicated and messy than that. And I wanted a game that highlighted how difficult those challenges are translated into an operational environment. The problem in recommending it is it's completely unreasonable demand on the game controller. I read 15,000 independent email messages personally during the week that I'm running it. And usually I'm attending something like 40 simultaneous chat groups on different platforms. I barely eat that week, and I certainly don't sleep. So I wouldn't recommend it, but it does actually work really well for the purpose. I have students a decade later emailing me from the field saying something happened today in South Sudan or Darfur or Afghanistan, and it reminded me of the game. Barwick Green, around a dozen players, tactical peacekeeping operations, cross-cultural communications, easily modified for online play, though no one's done that yet. Does anyone understand the reference here? If you've played the game and someone's told you, but does anyone understand the reference here? I'm going to give you a hint. Okay, whoops. If you didn't understand the reference, that is the tune Barwick Green, which is a game, which is the theme song to the long-running BBC radio series, The Archers. This is essentially a fictional UN peacekeeping mission in post-Civil War Britain, set in the context of Ambridge, which is the little village or town that The Archers is set in, with many of the same characters and locations and so forth. And you're a Bangladeshi battalion commander. The Civil War is over, but there's arms smuggling and political activity. But mainly what is going on is village life. And this game is absolutely brilliant. It's a Jim Wallman design, because what you soon realize is the outside peacekeeping stabilization force has very little idea of what's going on. Much of what is going on has nothing to do with the conflict. It's village rivalries. It's rivalries between the competing pubs. It's secret romances. It's organizing the village fete. And it's weapons smuggling and political mobilization and so forth. And the brilliant thing about this game is, if you find when you play it, you missed much of what is going on, and yet it is set in a small British village, which is the single most culturally familiar, iconic thing in the Western English-speaking world. How on earth are you going to know what's going on if you get deployed to DRC or Mali? If you cannot, in a simple game, really get a good grip on what's going on in the village of Barwick Green, what are the challenges of doing that in the field mission, and how does that lead you to have to behave in the field mission? I think it's absolutely brilliant. I spent part of my childhood growing up in a small English village, so I think this is a particularly brilliant design. So any of you want to run something in your unit to highlight the sort of information challenges of peace and stabilization operations, I talked to Jim Wallman about this, because it doesn't get used much. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Okay, so just some final thoughts, and then we can go to the Q&A. Absolutely, whole point, Fight Club, play games. But if you're playing games, do think, am I playing them just because they're fun? Nothing wrong with that. Or are they valuable for purpose? Fun is a double-edged sword, because people will overlook weaknesses in game models because they enjoy the game, or they'll take game models they like because they like them and not necessarily because they think, am I really learning the right stuff from it? But also play the metagame. You know, when you war game, what is the designer trying to do? How might they be wrong? What might be missing? What is the model of insurgency or counterinsurgency that this game is trying to embody? So what you could do when you're wargaming with games that are less than perfect representations of the reality, and they all are, some more than others, is you can actually learn from the process of thinking, okay, what is in this game and what is not in the game? What is different in real life than the way this game operates? And that can be as valuable. In fact, there's some evidence that it's more valuable than actually playing the game. You should always, critically reflect on the game and not just play. That's why you learn so much in the debrief. Beyond that, design. If you're gonna run a game, design and facilitate for purpose. So what's your game objectives? Who are your participants? What are your constraints? So those of you in the professional space who might be putting on counterinsurgency or stabilization games, these are the same things I say to every serious game designer. Think about what you're trying to do and center that, as opposed to taking a game and cramming that square peg of a game into a round hole. You want to design for purpose. Finally, and here's the point I think is particularly relevant to Fight Club, game design is itself a learning process. There's a significant evidence that you learn more from designing a game than you do playing a game, because you really have to think through what are the variables that matter, how are they related, how am I going to represent them. So one of the things that Fight Club could certainly do is game design. How would you model something? I teach courses on game design. Students come back all the time and say, my God, I learned a lot about that particular conflict or that particular challenge from trying to think how I would model it in a game. So those are the points I wanted to make. General points about the importance and complexity of these kinds of operations. A tour through some well-known and less well-known games to make some particular points about the way they approach it and strengths and weaknesses. some final thoughts on the value of gaming and going beyond playing the games to thinking critically about the games, running games and designing games, not just to play them, but also to learn from the design process. And that's what I initially wanted to say. So at this point, I'm open to questions. I can see the chat, so I don't necessarily need a moderator to do this, but over to the moderators for a minute, and then we could go to the Q&A.
Yeah, Rex, so happy if you want to just go through the ones in the chat. Sure.
So, in general, do you think these games, almost any of them, reflect the doctrinal guidance of the military civilian guidelines for professional education purposes? UrbanSim does. I mean, UrbanSim is an attempt to game FM 324, I guess, whatever it was, the U.S. Army's counterinsurgency module doctrine. So it absolutely does. Others don't. I mean, others aren't. Most of them aren't designed for PME purposes. They're designed for hobby play or other things. The Ready Initiative project I'm working on, the Save the Children project, the real challenge there, it's been super interesting, is that project is full of just dozens of people who are AIDS specialists, epidemiologists, and so forth. And getting their knowledge crammed into a 90-minute game has been a really interesting challenge. And how do you design a game that is in fact conveying what you want to say about best practices and learning objectives? And that's why I'm learning a lot from doing the game design there, in terms of forcing people to prioritize what's key, why do mistakes get made, can we model the process of making mistakes in the field, because you want to try and trick players into making those same mistakes so they can learn from them, and so forth. Where games don't reflect doctrine, I think that's a great opportunity to have a discussion. Is the game wrong, or is doctrine wrong? Because doctrine's not perfect either. Or is doctrine too limited, or is doctrine only giving you a particular perspective on the situation? So, in most conflicts, there'll be, say, a British Army or Canadian Army or US Army doctrine for stabilization in a place like Afghanistan. And UNHCR has its own doctrine for dealing with displaced populations. They're both doctrinal. They don't connect at any point because they see the problem and the objectives and the tools and what you can do and what you can't do completely different. Do you know equivalent games the Russians and Belarusians are using to teach this subject? I do not know what the Russians are using, and I suspect they're not. I suspect from what we know of Russian wargaming that their wargaming is very much kinetically unit oriented. Now, one thing gets back to the doctrine question. There are different ways of finding insurgencies. I mean, there's the whole hearts and minds, FM 324, the graduate level of war. It's not kinetic. It's not even primarily kinetic. And then there's the way that the Russians do counterinsurgency, or the Sri Lankans did counterinsurgency, or the Syrians do counterinsurgency, which is let's kill a lot of people and we don't mind if they hate us as long as they're terrified. Right? So you can try and change local behaviors by winning people over and creating a stable central government, or you can drop sarin on them and forcibly displace them and terrify them and try to send the signal that they better not sit on the fence because otherwise the costs are very high. So, the way the Russians think about counterinsurgency, I think, is very different than the way the West thinks about counterinsurgency, because the West is not going to, do what the Russians do in Syria and bomb hospitals for the purposes of damaging the quality of life in rebel-held areas. Next question: if you were to create a short list for introduction to Stability COIN war games, what would be on it? Well, I kind of did that. There are lots more out there, not all of which I've played. Partly because when I want to do it for teaching purposes, I just found it far better to design my own game. I spend a lot of time telling people, if they're using it for professional purposes, to go design their own, because I think certainly with matrix games and they can be designed quite quickly. I ran one at DSTL on Israel, Lebanon, in which we literally designed it in one session. I think that was when Tom, you were with me at that session, I think, and then we just played the next day. I just put all the pieces together in my hotel room overnight. So some game systems are actually quite easy to develop. How do you evaluate the design of what people are actually learning from the game? That is really important question, Thomas, because what you think your players are learning is not always what they're learning. So when I debrief Brynen, all the students in the class, all 100 of them, have to do a written debrief. And then after those are handed in, I do a verbal debrief from the point of view of the game controller. Then I read all of their written debriefs. And then I have to do a second debrief because it's sometimes apparent that what people thought was happening was not actually what was happening because of fog of war. And this is a challenge. Phil Sabin talks about fog of war in his book on designing war games. He points out that fog of war makes the game more realistic, but it makes it very hard to learn from a game because you don't actually know why things happen because fog of war. So the more fog of war you have, the more realistic the game is. The more fog of war you have, the harder it is for a player to know why things happen in the game because some things were hidden from them. So I find it very useful to talk to my players after the game to get a sense of what they thought they learned and do actually two debriefs, my initial debrief and then my debrief informed by the players' debriefs. Yeah, I mean, Barwick Green, I don't know how hard designing a Barwick Green type game, I do not think is terribly hard. I mean, I have a copy of the not available version of Barwick Green. Essentially, Barwick Green is, from the point of view of the peacekeeping operation, it's entirely free Kriegspiel. You want to set up a checkpoint, you just tell control you want to set up a checkpoint, and then the map will be marked with a checkpoint. So completely free Kriegspiel. From the player point of view, they're trying to make money and do certain social tasks, which are, for the most part, independent of the Civil War, although some of them are political partisans and they have particular tasks, but they're kind of role-playing it in a way. There's a very loose kind of game mechanism there. So doing it, I think is not particularly hard. One of my favorite things of Barwick Green is that the Bangladeshi force commander can't directly talk to any of the British villagers because of language issues. They have to go through the translator, and the translator is a Brit from South London, but of Bangladeshi origin, who neither understands the Bangladeshi peacekeepers very well because he's a South Londoner, nor does he understand villagers very well because he's a South Londoner, but has to convince everyone that he is the expert interlocutor. And it's just a brilliant role, and happens a lot in real life where your intermediaries' social influence and power depends on them convincing everyone that they're far more competent than they actually are. What's the best stability coin war game you've played recently? I must admit, I love We Are Coming Nineveh, but I'm completely biased since it was my students and I'm involved. Brian Train's also involved in that game too. Culture of D6 dice roll, 6 is too good. Yeah, I mean, well, 2d6 is nice because it gives you a little bit of a bell curve. That's fine. Tom Mowat and I could have a discussion here in Matrix games about rolling dice or probability polling, asking your players for the probability of success, and then either taking the mean or the median or the average of that. It kind of depends what you're doing. In an educational setting, you may want to reduce some of the extreme results because you only get to run the game once with your audience, and they will learn less from a really fluky outcome than they will from something that's more in the middle, the more common area of the problem space. So, that is always a question too. When I run Aftershock, I'm going to give away a trade secret here. When I run Aftershock for professional reasons, it has a card draw system. So it has random event cards, except for when I run it with audiences, when I'm training, they're not actually random. They all think they're random, but I've gone through them and sequenced the challenges in a particular order in order to maximize the learning with that particular audience. But because I do that before the game starts, they tend to assume that the face down cards are random, but they're not. So I've given away a trade secret there. Games from a Western mindset. Yeah, I mean, this is a real challenge. This is one of the reasons I like Barwick Green, even though it's from a Western mindset, because the game is dominated by the internal dynamics of the local population. And far too many counterinsurgency games privilege the view of the outsider, of the peacekeeping mission, of the counterinsurgents, and so on and so forth. In terms of mindset, otherwise, I mean, I'm not sure that there's an African mindset or a Middle Eastern mindset, because it kind of depends on whether you're the dominant group or the subordinate group. If you had a bunch of Iraqis designing games counter ISIS, you get very different games depending on their political views. It wouldn't be an Iraqi version of a counter ISIS game. One of the things we absolutely did centrally, and Juliet, who was Deliminez, who was the initial person behind it, was one of my students at the time. She wanted to do a game which emphasized that most of the war against ISIS was fought by Iraqis and Syrians, but at this phase, particularly Iraqis. And so in that game, the coalition appears as a few air support cards. You don't actually even get coalition markers, because most of the fighting in Mosul was actually done on the ground by Iraqi army and Iraqi police and Iraqi counterterrorism service. And that game is deliberately designed to be Iraqi-centric. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Mosul, which I will strongly recommend because I think it's an absolutely brilliant war movie. Very much told from the Iraqi point of view, right down to getting the Mosul accents right. It's entirely in Arabic with subtitles. But We Are Coming Nineveh plays a lot like the game Mosul in terms of perspective. Afghan border sterilizer control, that's a game design issue. Some discussion on how many 3d6s we should roll. Propaganda and information op. This is a really interesting question, because there are games in which you want to center the content of information operations, because that's really important. And so you might want a matrix game in which people actually have to frame the message, and then players are adjudicating the quality of the message and how it will resonate. And there are games when an information operation might just give you a +1 because it slightly improves the operational environment and you don't need to model it. Kind of depends why you're running the game. I'd say incidentally, the same thing applies to cyber. You know, there's cyber games which the how the cyber actually operates is super critical to that audience and that purpose. And there's cyber games in which cyber should just be a +1 because it doesn't really matter if your headquarters isn't working because its computers were hacked, or its comms were jammed, or it was hit with a BM-21 strike. The effect is the same. Your headquarters isn't operating very well for a while, and you don't really need to model in detail how it happened. There's a question about variation in realism. There's a lot of variation in realism. Okay, I'm just sort of, someone mentions Brian Train. Brian Train loves quirky, interesting topics. I mean, he's done some straightforward kinetic games too, on the Scheldt and the Battle of the Bulge and so forth. But there are a lot of cool Brian Train games about insurgency, counterinsurgency, civil powers, riot policing, and so forth. Brian lives to design around those quirky topics. That's where his design brain lives, and we are all richer for it. Any questions I've missed, or anything else that anyone wants to ask?
Rex, I'll put one in if you don't mind.
Sure.
So we're getting to a point where artificial intelligence and machine learning and other things potentially can be getting into some of that complexity that you say is often simplified in games because of the human game master loading or the player loading, etc. So do you think this is going to change wargaming in this field, or do you think it's always going to come back down to what humans can cognitively understand in the moment?
So, I mean, certainly the application of AI to playing red, so you're playing against an automated opponent, that has got more and more sophisticated. I mean, early AIs weren't AIs at all. It was just that the other side actually could see where units were and it cheated, or it produced stuff faster, or what have you. We're getting to more and more sophisticated red in commercial computer games. That is good, but you can reach the point where the game is too complicated for people to understand what is going on. You'll notice if you play first-person shooters against an automated opponent, in most of them, unless they're really designed for combat realism, your opponent tends to engage you from your front arc. The reason is surveys show that people who buy computer games don't like computer games in which you're playing, and you're suddenly dead and you have no idea why, because you never saw who shot you, even though that's the way you actually die in combat very often. Now, people want to see their opponent or see the fire, and because the computer makes it very hard to see your sight arc. I mean, you can swivel, but it's not as efficient as it is in real life. Most first-person shooters are biased to try and keep the automated opponent to your front arc so that you feel it's a fair fight. Now, of course, if you train for tactical operations, you train to not make it a fair fight for your opponent, right? You're trying to flank them, you're trying to use cover. If they all die and they never saw where you were, that's actually successful. In tactical military operations, it is not a good way of designing a first-person shooter for the commercial market, unless someone's, you know, going for kind of ARMA levels of greater realism. I had ARMA, actually ARMA was on my initial slide. I didn't talk about it, but there's an ARMA downloadable content on laws of war, which has got NGOs and so forth in it. So it was one of the images on the opening slide. So there is that trade-off in commercial games that the players don't actually want to play against a fully realistic opponent, because there's certain challenges they prefer to others, and the AI has to be tweaked for the player's expectations of how they'll be engaged, not necessarily what's most realistic. Okay, so RCAT does require someone who understands how to put RCAT together. Matrix games, yeah, maybe not. I don't think they're, I mean, I don't find them that hard to facilitate. Some people do and some people don't. How are they being trained, Andrew? It's a kind of weird process of osmosis at the moment. I mean, there are some places where U.S. Army War College uses matrix games. And when I say they use matrix games, they will have a matrix game and they will run 20 simultaneous copies of that matrix game, having trained the 20 student facilitators in a bunch of other matrix games before they run the matrix games for everyone in the class at the same time. So there are some places where there's industrial level of using matrix games in PME, including the training of the people who can run them. And I think a lot of people, once they've played a matrix game, actually pick up on how it's designed and how they can design it, and others don't. This is a point that Graham Longley Brown often makes, and I do, and Tom Mowat does. If you've ever been a DM in D&D, that is a not dissimilar skill from running a matrix game, in terms of keeping a discussion going, not letting things bog down, and so on and so forth. So ironically, I think one of I think the best training for facilitating professional war games or other serious games is being a DM. It's not a tongue-in-cheek point. I absolutely think that nothing is quite as efficient as running RPGs.
Thank you, Rex. And one thing I would say as DSTL, the kind of point to that question you asked earlier, why aren't we using RCAT? And as you know, someone who's had you and experienced that now I know you stacked the deck against us. That's why we had such a challenge when we were playing. But I would just say that I think that's one of our key areas and gaps, is that we aren't necessarily formalizing that training process. And absolutely, as you said, it's a bit more of osmosis at the minute. And hopefully, if we can change that culture and get that so people are being trained a bit like they're doing in the US, maybe we can get more people using RCAT and other tools appropriately.
I'll also make a point that I think in the defense space, there's an awful lot of putting time and effort into producing a often very good, sometimes less good game, and then it has a splash for a year or two, and then it just kind of fades. So UrbanSim, RCAT, I don't know how often Strike is being used now. So a lot of work goes into producing a game, and I think there's much less attention to shelf life, which is an ongoing thing in order to make sure that the resources there and the training there and the evangelism is there and people learn about it and so on and so forth. So that is a systematic problem with, I think, the defense space creating games, and then they kind of fade after a while.
Thanks, Rex. I think there may have been a couple of questions just above my one that someone has posted in. I don't know if you want to answer them, Rex, or if you've seen them. But then if there aren't any more questions, then I think I've got to do a summary from Ed's perspective. But please have a look at those just from Vish, if that's okay.
Do you have any suggestions for running your later, I think, larger scale games? So Brynen started with a class of 10, and then it escalated to a class of 100 over several years. That's just kind of insane, but I don't think it's one of the advantages of relatively free Kriegspiel games is that there aren't complicated rule sets, and you can nudge the players towards the situations and learning that you want to do, provided you keep the, you don't introduce too much for you to monitor. The real challenge is monitoring what the students are doing, particularly if they're all, if it's red versus blue, it's easier to know what's going on. If there are, those 100 players are probably in about 40 teams of people doing different things. So that gets much harder to work out all the interaction combinations. But I do think that those large kind of complex games are quite useful. The game behind me isn't a counterinsurgency game. It's an 8 to civil power game with kaiju, so giant lobsters, and there's a seagull somewhere. But the actual civil powers part is completely accurate. So it means that's the entire Canadian Armed Forces in Atlantic Canada down to the company level, plus RCMP and other first responders and utility crews and so on and so forth. And thereby keeping the rules relatively simple, we can have 100 people play for 7 hours in a kind of mega game context. And I think mega games work well too. Most of them are not entirely serious. I mean, that one's got monsters in it, but it's not that difficult to design a mega game that is, with experienced mega games people that would do a serious version of counterinsurgency or peace operations. Jim Wallman's got War and Binny, which is a peace operation.
Perfect. Thank you for answering all those questions, Rex. And also thank you so much for taking part and for giving the talk. What we're going to do is I'm just going to give the notice now, unless there's any final points from yourself, and we'll talk through some of the Fight Club future activities that are just about to come out.
Sure, and I'll advance to the next slide.
Thank you so much, Rex. So a quick one from me. I've been asked to highlight that you can possibly see us in person if you're able to visit us from the 24th to the 26th of May. The DSET conference, some of the Fight Club Council and key members are going to be there. We're going to be demonstrating a stand and talking to the kind of wider defence collective about what we're doing with Fight Club. And on your screen right now is some of the kind of Fight Club branded merchandise that is being handed out to both people that have taken part in the campaigns of learning, which is a Fight Club pin, and also the new Fight Club challenge coin. Very American, but it's got our motto on there: think, fight, learn, repeat. And you can only get those either if you're taking part in a Fight Club activity or if you meet us at the event. I did notice there was a question from the audience about, are we setting up any games? Is Fight Club running any gaming activity? Well, over the past year, because of the COVID pandemic, we have done some closed games behind the wire, and that's been to support both DSTL and the Ministry of Defence. Obviously, our plan and our goal for Fight Club is always to run events, and the hope is that in Connections this year, September, UK Connections will be running some games remotely, but as soon as we can organise something, where it be in a pub or somewhere appropriate to do some actual gaming, we're absolutely looking forward to doing that. The final point then from me to raise, I'm just going to check through on our list, is just to see if there was anything. Yes, so there's Take That Hill, which was designed originally by Professor Philip Sabin, has been adapted by Fight Club. We're about to receive a large delivery of those box games. So hopefully, as Rex said, we're not just going to use this and forget about it in a year. We're going to be able to distribute those for free, 2 units. So please get in touch and watch that space. And the final one is that Sweeping Satellites, which is a new space game that has been adapted by Fight Club, has been now complete. And so we're looking forward to sharing the results from that. So thank you all so much for signing in, and thank you again to Rex for giving such an excellent brief. We look forward to seeing you at the next one.